The rope stopped swaying. Martha Kowalski's weathered hands clutched her shawl tighter as the executioner tested the noose one final time, his boots echoing across the silent courthouse square of Redemption Falls. 3 hours until they hanged an innocent woman. The crowd had gathered before dawn, faces twisted with bloodlust and righteousness. But something felt wrong. The condemned woman stood motionless on the gallows platform, her Cherokee braids catching the October morning light, refusing to beg or weep like they expected. She hadn't spoken a single word in 6 weeks. Old Martha's heart lurched. She remembered her own daughter at that age, proud, defiant, destroyed by men who called themselves righteous. "Lord Almighty," whispered the blacksmith, his hammer slipping from trembling fingers. "She looks like she's praying." The sheriff checked his pocket watch, sweat beading despite the autumn chill. "Get the preacher." "Get him now." But in the distance, hoofbeats thundered against the morning silence. Who would ride so hard toward a hanging? And why did the woman's lips curve into the faintest smile when she heard them coming? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, the autumn leaves had just begun their golden dance when Judge Cornelius Thornfield collapsed during the weekly town meeting. Sarah Running Bear Thompson was kneading bread in her small cabin when young Tommy Peterson burst through her door, his face pale as fresh snow. "Miss Sarah, come quick! The judge is dying!" She'd seen death before, too many times in her 25 years. Her Cherokee grandmother had taught her the old ways of healing, while the German missionaries had shown her their medicines. Both bloodlines flowed through her veins like 2 rivers meeting in a storm, never quite settling into peace. The townspeople of Redemption Falls called her the half-breed healer when they needed her skills, and that savage woman when they didn't. Judge Thornfield's mansion stood like a monument to white prosperity on the hill overlooking their small Wyoming settlement. Sarah had only been inside once before when his wife needed help birthing a stillborn child 3 years past. Now she climbed those same oak steps, her medicine bag clutched tight, knowing she was walking into something that would change everything. The judge writhed on his 4-poster bed, his silver hair matted with sweat. Black vomit stained his nightshirt, and his eyes rolled white as winter moons. His wife Elizabeth wrung her hands in the corner, while Dr. Harrison stood helpless with his limited frontier medicine. "Poison," she whispered, recognizing the symptoms immediately. "But not what you think." Sarah had learned to read the language of sickness the way others read newspapers. This wasn't murder. This was a liver dying slowly from years of whiskey and guilt. She'd seen it before in men who carried too many secrets. She worked through the night, brewing teas from willow bark and prairie sage, forcing drops of healing tincture between his cracked lips. Sometimes he muttered words in his delirium, calling out a name that made her hands tremble. "Little Singing Bird, forgive me, Little Singing Bird." That was her mother's Cherokee name, the name no white man in Redemption Falls should have known. By morning, color had returned to Thornfield's cheeks, but Sarah's world had shattered like glass on stone. Attorney Silas Peterson arrived early, his eyes sharp as a hawk's when he saw her medicine bag on the nightstand. He'd been circling the judge's wealth like a vulture for months. Everyone knew it. "Mighty convenient timing," Peterson said, his voice dripping false concern. "Judge takes sick the very night the half-breed tends to him." Mrs. Thornfield's face went white. "But Sarah saved his life." Peterson picked up a small brown bottle from Sarah's bag, one she'd never seen before. "Then why," he said, holding it up to catch the lamplight, "does she carry arsenic?" The room fell silent except for the judge's labored breathing and Sarah's world collapsing around her like a house built on sand. The arsenic bottle felt like ice in Peterson's palm as he held it high for everyone to see. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd never seen that bottle before in her life. But who would believe her? The amber glass gleamed in the lamplight like a serpent's eye, and she knew with sickening certainty that her fate was sealed. "I've never seen that before," she whispered, but her words fell into the room like stones into a deep well. Peterson's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Course you haven't, girl. That's what they all say when they get caught red-handed." He turned to Mrs. Thornfield, whose face had gone pale as morning frost. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we'll need to call Sheriff Mason. This here's attempted murder, clear as day." Mrs. Thornfield wrung her hands, her voice trembling. "But Silas, she saved Cornelius. Look at him. He's breathing easier now." "Mighty convenient, ain't it?" Peterson pocketed the bottle with practiced ease. "Save a man's life after you tried to take it. Makes for a perfect cover story." Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet like a ship in a storm. She'd spent her life walking the razor's edge between two worlds, too Cherokee for the white folks, too white for what remained of her people. Now, she was falling into the chasm between them, and there was nothing to catch her but the hard ground of frontier justice. The sheriff arrived within the hour, his badge catching the first rays of dawn. Tom Mason was a fair man by frontier standards, but fairness had its limits when it came to half-breeds and poison. Sarah watched his weathered face as Peterson spun his tale, saw the resignation settle in his eyes like dust after a storm. "Sarah Thompson," Sheriff Mason said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm placing you under arrest for the attempted murder of Judge Cornelius Thornfield." The shackles felt cold against her wrists. She'd worn iron before, not chains, but the wedding band her husband Thomas had placed on her finger 5 years ago. He'd been different from other white men, had seen past her mixed blood to something worth loving. But Thomas was 3 years dead now, killed by a rattlesnake while checking his traps, and she was alone again in a world that had never wanted her. Word spread through Redemption Falls faster than wildfire in a dry summer. By noon, half the town had gathered outside the jail, their voices rising and falling like a tide of judgment. Some called for immediate hanging. "Don't waste time on no trial for a savage." Others, mostly women who'd benefited from Sarah's healing touch during difficult births, whispered doubts about Peterson's story. Martha Kowalski pushed through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. At 68, the Polish immigrant had buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children on the frontier. She'd earned her right to speak, and speak she did. "You fools are letting that snake Peterson pull wool over your eyes," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too much of life to be easily fooled. "That girl delivered half your babies and saved more lives than the rest of us combined. You really think she'd poison the judge?" But fear had already taken root. Fear of the different, the unknown, the Cherokee blood that some folks believed carried curses in its veins. Peterson fanned these flames with skill born of desperation. He needed Sarah gone before anyone discovered his own debts to unsavory men in Cheyenne, his forged papers, his plans for the judge's considerable estate. In her cell, Sarah sat on the thin straw mattress and listened to the voices outside. Some demanded justice, others mercy, but none seemed to wonder about the truth. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice singing Cherokee lullabies, tried to feel Thomas's gentle hands in her hair, tried to find some corner of peace in the storm that was coming. The preliminary hearing was set for the following Monday. 3 days to live as a free woman, though free was hardly the word for it. The jail cell was 8 feet by 6 feet, with bars that cast prison shadows across her face. But Sarah had lived in prisons before. The prison of being neither fully Cherokee nor white. the prison of being a woman alone in a man's world, the prison of loving someone the world said she had no right to love. As the sun set on her first night in captivity, Sarah heard something that made her heart skip. The distant sound of horse hooves on the hard-packed road leading into town. A rider was coming hard and fast like someone racing against time itself. She pressed her face against the small barred window and saw a figure in the distance, tall, straight-backed, riding like the devil himself was giving chase. The rider approached like thunder across the prairie, his horse's hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth with the urgency of a man racing against time itself. James McCarthy had covered 3 days' worth of ground in 2, pushing both himself and his mount to their limits when word reached him at the territorial outpost about Sarah's arrest. The telegram had been brief, but devastating. Half-breed woman charged with attempted murder. Trial set for Monday. Come quick if you care about Thomas's widow. He did care, more than he'd allowed himself to admit during the long months since his last visit to Redemption Falls. Thomas had been gone 3 years now, taken by a rattlesnake's bite while checking his trap lines, and James had promised his dying brother that he would look after Sarah if she ever needed protection. But Sarah had seemed so self-sufficient, so quietly strong in her grief, that he'd convinced himself she was better off without reminders of her loss. Now, as the town's wooden buildings came into view through the dust and heat shimmer, James felt the familiar weight of arriving too late. The streets were busier than usual for a weekday, with clusters of people gathered outside the saloon and general store, their voices carrying an excitement that made his stomach clench. Nothing drew a crowd like the promise of frontier justice, especially when it involved someone different enough to make an easy target. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, where Tom Mason stood on the front porch like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. The 2 men had served together briefly during the Apache campaigns, and James could read the conflict written across the sheriff's weathered features. "James," Mason said, removing his hat as the cavalry officer dismounted. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts. Got word about Sarah." James tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements economical and controlled despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. "What's this nonsense about attempted murder?" Mason's eyes shifted away from direct contact. "Found her with Judge Thornfield when he took sick. Peterson says she poisoned him with some kind of Indian remedy." He gestured toward the jail's small, barred window. "She's been quiet as church on Sunday since we brought her in. Won't say a word in her own defense." James felt something cold settle in his chest. Sarah's silence wasn't submission. It was the careful stillness of someone who had learned that words could be twisted into weapons against her. He'd seen that same quality in Thomas, the way his brother had chosen his moments to speak carefully, measuring each word for its potential to cause harm or healing. "Can I see her?" Mason hesitated, then nodded toward the jail door. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you without Peterson making a fuss." The jail smelled of unwashed bodies and despair, but when James approached Sarah's cell, he found her sitting on the narrow cot with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap like she was attending Sunday service. She looked up as his footsteps approached, and something flickered in her dark eyes. Recognition, relief, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Hello, James?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear the exhaustion beneath it. "Sarah?" He settled into the wooden chair that had been placed outside her cell, studying her face in the dim light that filtered through the barred window. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones more prominent, but there was still that quality of quiet strength that had drawn Thomas to her like a moth to flame. "Tell me what happened." She was quiet for a long moment, and James waited with the patience of a man who had learned to read silences as clearly as spoken words. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had stopped expecting to be believed. Judge Thornfield collapsed during the town meeting. They sent for me because Dr. Harrison was visiting his daughter in Cheyenne. She paused, her fingers tracing the simple silver band she still wore on her left hand. The judge was dying, James. His liver was rotting from years of whiskey, and his body was shutting down piece by piece. I used what I knew: willow bark tea, prairie sage, some of the old remedies my grandmother taught me. And it helped. He was getting stronger. Then what? Peterson arrived the next morning with that bottle. Said he found it in my medicine bag, but I'd never seen it before in my life. Her eyes met his through the bars, and James saw no deception there, only the steady honesty that had been Thomas's anchor in a world full of shifting loyalties. Someone put it there while I was working to save the judge's life. James felt the pieces of a familiar pattern falling into place, the kind of setup he'd seen during his years as a territorial marshal when men with something to hide needed someone else to take the blame. What does Peterson gain if you're convicted? Sarah's smile was bitter as autumn frost. The judge has no sons, and his will leaves everything to charity unless someone contests it. Peterson's been handling his legal affairs for years. With me dead and the judge grateful for his protection from Cherokee witchcraft, he could probably convince a sick old man to show more appreciation for loyal friends. The cold in James's chest spread outward like ice on a winter pond. He'd seen Peterson's type before, men who wore respectability like a mask while their souls rotted from the inside. They were the most dangerous kind of predator because they understood how to use society's prejudices as weapons. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to know that Thomas made me promise to look after you if you ever needed help. I should have been here sooner." Her eyes softened for the first time since he'd arrived. "You couldn't have known. And Thomas wouldn't want you to carry guilt that isn't yours to bear." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But James, if they convict me, don't let them say it was justice. Don't let them pretend this town didn't know exactly what it was doing." Outside, the courthouse bell began to toll, marking the hour with the finality of a funeral knell. James stood, his mind already working through the legal possibilities and territorial laws that might offer Sarah some protection. He had 3 days before the trial began in earnest. 3 days to unravel Peterson's web of lies and find evidence that would convince a jury of white men to see past their prejudices. It wouldn't be enough time, but it would have to be. The days following the preliminary hearing blurred together like watercolors in rain. James McCarthy had ridden into town like an avenging angel, but even angels had to work within the corrupt system that Peterson had so carefully constructed. Sarah's case had become the talk of 3 counties, drawing newspaper men from as far as Denver and curious onlookers who treated her impending trial like a traveling circus. James spent his mornings in the makeshift office Sheriff Mason had given him, poring over territorial law books and witness statements. His afternoons were consumed with riding between homesteads, questioning anyone who might have seen Peterson near the Thornfield mansion that fateful night. The evenings found him pacing outside Sarah's jail cell, their conversations growing longer and more intimate as the walls between them slowly crumbled. "Tell me about Thomas," he said one evening, settling into the wooden chair he'd taken to bringing each night. The jail smelled of unwashed bodies and despair, but Sarah's presence somehow made it bearable. Sarah's hands stilled on the quilt she was mending, one of many charitable offerings from the town's women who remained quietly divided about her guilt. "He was your brother. You knew him better than I did." "I knew the boy who left home at 16 to make his fortune," James said, his voice soft in the lamplight. "I didn't know the man who fell in love with a Cherokee healer and built a cabin by the creek." A small smile touched Sarah's lips, the first genuine expression of joy James had seen since his arrival. "He used to bring me wildflowers every morning. Said a woman should wake up to beauty, not just another day of survival. Her fingers traced the wedding ring she still wore, a simple band of silver that had tarnished with time and tears. The morning he died, he brought me Indian paintbrush, red as blood, pretty as sunset. I pressed one in my Bible. It's still there. James felt something twist in his chest, part grief for his brother and part something else entirely. He always did have an eye for beautiful things. Their eyes met through the bars, and Sarah felt her breath catch. There was something in his gaze that reminded her of Thomas, but deeper, older, marked by war and loss in ways her gentle husband had never been. James carried his pain like a soldier carries his rifle, always ready, always present, but controlled. "Why are you really here?" she asked. "And don't tell me it's just about a promise to a dead man." James was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Sarah shivered at the lonely sound. "Because," he finally said, "I've seen too many innocent people die for other men's greed. In the war, in the Indian campaigns, in towns just like this one. I'm tired of being too late." The next morning brought Martha Kowalski with fresh bread and devastating news. She bustled into the jail like a woman on a mission, her gray hair escaping its pins and her face flushed with indignation. "That Peterson's been busy as a bee in clover," she announced, setting down her basket and fixing James with a look that could melt iron. "Talk to my neighbor's boy. You know, the one who works at the telegraph office? Peterson's been sending messages back and forth to Cheyenne, and not about any legal business, neither." James straightened in his chair. "What kind of messages?" "Money troubles, from what the boy could make out. Seems our fine attorney owes some powerful bad men a considerable sum." Martha's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Men who don't take kindly to waiting for their payment." This was the break James had been praying for. He spent the day riding hard to Cheyenne, following Martha's lead like a bloodhound on a scent. What he found there made his blood run cold. Peterson owed money to 3 different gambling houses, had forged documents to secure loans he couldn't repay, and had been seen in the company of men who settled debts with bullets rather than lawsuits. But more damning still was the conversation James overheard in the Silver Dollar Saloon. Peterson was there, drunk and boastful, spinning tales about his brilliant plan to frame that half-breed witch and claim the Thornfield estate through legal manipulation. "Judge is sicker than anyone knows," Peterson slurred to his gambling companions. "Liver's rotting out from all that whiskey. Won't last the month, mark my words. Soon as the girl hangs, I'll be handling his affairs permanent-like." James felt his hand drift toward his gun, but frontier justice wouldn't save Sarah now. He needed evidence, witnesses, something that would hold up in a territorial court. He spent 2 more days in Cheyenne, carefully documenting Peterson's debts and finding men willing to testify about the attorney's desperate financial situation. Meanwhile, back in Redemption Falls, Sarah was experiencing her own revelations. Judge Thornfield had taken a turn for the worse, and despite the protests of his wife and Dr. Harrison, he insisted on being brought to the jail to see Sarah. They carried him in on a stretcher, his face gray as winter ash, his breathing labored and painful. "Clear the room," he wheezed, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Mrs. Thornfield started to protest, but her husband's glare silenced her. Even Peterson, who had been hovering like a vulture, reluctantly stepped outside. When they were alone, Thornfield struggled to sit up on his makeshift bed. "I know who you are," he whispered, his voice barely audible through the bars. Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. "I don't know what you mean." "Little Singing Bird." The Cherokee name fell from his lips like a stone into still water. "Your mother. She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw. beautiful and wild and pure as mountain water. The blood drained from Sarah's face. She gripped the bars of her cell until her knuckles went white. "You're delusional. The sickness is affecting your mind." "I was young and stupid and scared," Thornfield continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My father threatened to disown me if I married a Cherokee woman. Said it would ruin our family name, destroy our standing in the community. So I left her carrying my child." Sarah sank onto her cot, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. The father she'd never known, the white man her mother had loved and lost, the reason she'd grown up in the mission school instead of with her Cherokee relatives, it was all connected to the man lying broken before her. "I tried to forget," Thornfield whispered. "Married Elizabeth, built my fortune, became respectable. But I never forgot little Singing Bird's face or the way she sang to the morning stars." He looked at Sarah with eyes full of 25 years of regret. "You have her eyes, her spirit. I knew it the moment I saw you, but I was too much a coward to acknowledge it." "Then why?" Sarah's voice broke like ice in spring. "Why let Peterson destroy me? Why not speak up?" Thornfield closed his eyes, the weight of his shame nearly unbearable. "Because I'm a selfish old fool who thought he could take his secrets to the grave. Because admitting you're my daughter means admitting I abandoned the only woman I ever truly loved." He struggled to breathe, each word costing him dearly. "But I can't let you die for my sins. I won't let that snake Peterson profit from my cowardice." The conversation was interrupted by Peterson's return, his face flushed with suspicion. "Judge, you shouldn't be exerting yourself. The doctor said—" "Get out." Thornfield's voice carried an authority that made even Peterson step back. "Get out, or I'll tell everyone in this town exactly what kind of man you really are." Peterson's face went pale, but he retreated, his mind already racing with plans to accelerate his timeline. If Thornfield was going to confess, if Sarah's parentage was going to be revealed, he needed her dead before anyone could piece together the truth. That night, as Sarah lay on her cot staring at the ceiling, she tried to process everything that had happened. The father she'd hated for abandoning her mother was the same man she'd spent her life healing, the same man Peterson was slowly murdering with poison and neglect. The irony was bitter as wormwood tea. Outside her cell, the town slept uneasily. In 3 days, the trial would begin in earnest. Peterson worked feverishly to ensure the outcome, bribing witnesses and spreading rumors about Cherokee witchcraft. James rode back from Cheyenne with evidence that could change everything, if he could get it before an honest judge. And in the big house on the hill, Judge Cornelius Thornfield lay dying, wrestling with a decision that would either damn his reputation forever or save the daughter he'd never had the courage to claim. The pieces were all in motion now, like players in a deadly game of chess. Soon the truth would come out, all of it, ugly and beautiful and devastating. The only question was whether it would come in time to save Sarah from the noose that waited for her at dawn. The trial began on a crisp October morning with all the pomp and circumstance that Redemption Falls could muster. Judge Hamilton had been brought in from Cheyenne, a stern man with steel-gray whiskers and a reputation for fairness that even Peterson couldn't entirely corrupt. The courthouse overflowed with spectators who had traveled from neighboring counties, drawn by the spectacle of a half-breed woman accused of murdering a prominent white judge. Sarah entered the courtroom in the same simple blue dress she'd worn to Thomas's funeral 3 years prior. Her dark hair was braided with traditional Cherokee ribbons that Martha Kowalski had smuggled to her, a small act of defiance that made Peterson's jaw clench with rage. She held her head high despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists, moving with the dignity of someone who had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. James sat in the front row, his evidence folder thick with testimonies from Cheyenne and witness statements that painted Peterson in a decidedly different light than the heroic prosecutor he claimed to be. But territorial law was a tricky thing, and proving Peterson's guilt wouldn't necessarily prove Sarah's innocence. The arsenic bottle remained the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, and no amount of character assassination would make that evidence disappear. Peterson rose to address the jury with the theatrical flair that had made his reputation. 12 white men, mostly ranchers and shop owners, sat in judgment. Not one of them would have called Sarah neighbor or friend under normal circumstances. "Gentlemen of the jury," Peterson began, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom like a preacher's sermon. "We are here today because evil has walked among us disguised as healing." The defendant, Sarah Running Bear Thompson, used her knowledge of savage remedies and Cherokee witchcraft to attempt the cold-blooded murder of one of our most respected citizens. He held up the amber bottle like a holy relic, catching the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows. This bottle contained enough arsenic to kill a horse, hidden among her so-called healing potions like a snake in the garden. She gained Judge Thornfield's trust through false acts of mercy, then struck when he was most vulnerable. Sarah watched Peterson's performance with the detached calm of someone observing a stage play. She'd seen this kind of theater before, the way white men could twist truth into whatever shape served their purposes. Her mother had warned her about such men, had told her stories of Cherokee leaders who had trusted white promises only to find themselves on the trail of tears. But something was different about this performance. Peterson's usual smooth confidence seemed strained, his gestures too broad, his voice too loud. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his eyes kept darting to the back of the courtroom as if expecting unwelcome visitors. James noticed it too. During his investigations in Cheyenne, he'd learned that Peterson's gambling debts were coming due at the end of the month. Men had been asking questions about him, dangerous men who didn't accept excuses or promises. Peterson needed the Thornfield money, and he needed it soon. When it came time for the defense, James stood slowly. He'd never practiced law, but frontier justice often made lawyers of soldiers and soldiers of farmers. The territorial system was informal enough to allow him to speak for Sarah as her husband, though the marriage certificate felt like ashes in his pocket. A legal fiction that might save her life but couldn't heal the wounds that had brought them to this moment. "Gentlemen," James began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had led cavalry charges and buried too many friends, "you've heard a compelling story from Mr. Peterson. A story of treachery and poison, of savage ways turned against Christian charity. It's the kind of story that confirms what some of you might want to believe about folks who don't look like you or worship like you." He paused, letting his words settle into the crowded courtroom. In the gallery, Martha Kowalski nodded approval while other spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But here's what Mr. Peterson didn't tell you. He didn't tell you that Judge Thornfield's condition improved dramatically under Sarah's care. He didn't tell you that the arsenic bottle mysteriously appeared only after Sarah had spent hours saving the judge's life. And he certainly didn't tell you about his own desperate need for money. Peterson shot to his feet. "Objection. The defense is making wild accusations without evidence." Judge Hamilton peered over his spectacles with the patience of a man who had heard every legal trick in the book. "Mr. McCarthy, do you have evidence to support these claims?" James opened his folder and began laying out the testimonies from Cheyenne, sworn statements from gambling house owners, bartenders, and loan sharks who had all dealt with Peterson's increasing desperation. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the scope of the attorney's debts became clear. "Furthermore," James continued, "I present testimony from Mrs. Elizabeth Thornfield herself, who will attest that her husband's condition was improving under Sarah's care, not worsening." Mrs. Thornfield rose from her seat in the gallery, her face pale but determined. She had wrestled with her conscience for days, torn between loyalty to Peterson, a family friend, and the truth she had witnessed with her own eyes. "My husband was dying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Harrison had given up hope, but Sarah, she sat with him through 3 nights, forcing medicine down his throat when he was too weak to swallow, cooling his fever with herbs I'd never seen before." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "She saved his life, not tried to take it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Peterson's face had gone the color of old parchment, but he rallied quickly. "Your Honor, Mrs. Thornfield is clearly overwrought with grief. The defendant used savage potions and Cherokee witchcraft." "That's enough!" The voice came from the back of the courtroom, weak but commanding. Every head turned as Judge Cornelius Thornfield appeared in the doorway, supported by 2 men who had carried him from his deathbed. He looked like a walking corpse, his skin translucent and his breathing labored, but his eyes burned with purpose. Judge Hamilton pounded his gavel as the courtroom descended into chaos. "Order! Order in this court!" Thornfield shuffled forward, each step in obvious agony. "Your Honor," he wheezed, "I request permission to address this court." "Judge Thornfield, you should be in bed." Peterson started, but Thornfield silenced him with a look that could have melted steel. "I should be dead," Thornfield replied, his voice carrying despite its weakness. "Would be, if not for the woman you're trying to murder with lies." He turned to face the jury, and Sarah saw her own eyes reflected in his, the same dark brown, the same stubborn spark that had kept her alive through years of prejudice and loss. "Gentlemen, I stand before you as the supposed victim of this crime, and I tell you now, under oath and before God, that Sarah Running Bear Thompson saved my life." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "She saved the life of a man who didn't deserve it. She saved her own father." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. In the gallery, Mrs. Thornfield's face crumbled as 25 years of questions finally found their answers. Martha Kowalski gripped her shawl so tightly her knuckles went white. "That's right," Thornfield continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Sarah is my daughter, born to a Cherokee woman I loved more than my own life, and abandoned because I was too much a coward to stand against my family's prejudices." He looked directly at Sarah, and she saw a lifetime of regret in his weathered face. "Her mother's name was Little Singing Bird, and she was the finest woman I ever knew. Our daughter inherited her healing gifts and her pure heart." Peterson was on his feet, sputtering objections, but his voice was lost in the roar of shocked conversations that filled the courtroom. James felt his own world shift as pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Sarah's knowledge of Thornfield's condition, her determination to heal him despite the risks, the way she'd accepted her fate with such dignity. "The arsenic bottle was planted," Thornfield declared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sword. "Planted by a man so desperate for money that he would frame an innocent woman for a crime that never happened." His eyes found Peterson in the crowd. "A man who has been slowly poisoning me for weeks, not to kill me quickly, but to make me weak enough to change my will in his favor." The courtroom exploded again, but this time the angry voices were directed at Peterson, not Sarah. The attorney looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed plan crumbling like a house built on sand. "Lies!" he shouted. "All lies! You can't trust the word of a dying man who's clearly delusional." But it was too late. The truth had been spoken, and like wildfire on the prairie, it spread through every corner of the courtroom. Sarah sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as she processed everything she had just heard. Her father, the white man she had hated without knowing his name, had just destroyed his own reputation to save her life. Judge Hamilton pounded his gavel repeatedly, but the chaos was beyond his control. In the gallery, some spectators were already heading for the doors, eager to spread this incredible news throughout the territory. Others sat frozen, trying to reconcile their prejudices with this stunning revelation. And in the defendant's chair, Sarah Running Bear Thompson, daughter of Judge Cornelius Thornfield and the Cherokee woman he had loved and lost, finally understood that sometimes the truth was more powerful than any lie, more healing than any medicine, and more dangerous than any poison. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, but Peterson wasn't finished. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Silas Peterson had spent too many years manipulating the law to surrender without a fight. As Judge Thornfield collapsed back onto the stretcher, his strength finally spent, Peterson saw his last chance slipping away like water through his fingers. "Your Honor!" Peterson's voice cracked like a whip across the stunned courtroom. "This is nothing more than the desperate ravings of a dying man, poisoned by the very woman he's trying to protect. Judge Thornfield has been under the influence of Cherokee potions for weeks. His mind is clearly compromised." Judge Hamilton struggled to restore order as the gallery erupted in arguments. Half the spectators were on their feet, some demanding Sarah's immediate release, others shouting that Indian witchcraft had obviously bewitched the dying judge. The 12 jurors sat like stones in a river, overwhelmed by currents they couldn't navigate. "Furthermore," Peterson continued, his desperation making him reckless, "even if this wild tale were true, it only proves what we've known all along. That savage blood runs thick with poison. She killed her own father out of revenge for abandoning her heathen mother." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. In the space of minutes, she had gained a father and watched him destroy himself to save her life. Now Peterson was twisting even that sacrifice into another weapon against her. But something had shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. Mrs. Thornfield rose from her seat, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady as mountain stone. "How dare you?" she said, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "How dare you speak of my husband's mind when you've been the one poisoning him?" She turned to address the jury directly. "Gentlemen, I've watched Silas Peterson visit our home every day for the past month, always insisting on preparing my husband's medicine personally. I thought it was kindness. Now I see it was murder." Dr. Harrison stood up from his place in the gallery, his medical bag clutched in his weathered hands. "Mrs. Thornfield is correct. I prescribed laudanum for the judge's pain, but Mr. Peterson insisted on administering the doses himself. Said he wanted to ensure proper legal consultation during treatment." The old doctor's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "No attorney needs to be present for medical treatment unless he's making sure the patient dies on schedule." The courtroom shifted like a living thing, anger and shame and recognition washing over the assembled crowd in waves. Martha Kowalski pushed her way to the front, her gray hair wild and her Polish accent thick with emotion. "You want to know what poison looks like?" she called out, pointing a gnarled finger at Peterson. "I seen it before in the old country, not in bottles, but in hearts, in men who'd rather see innocent blood spilled than admit they've been fools." Peterson's face had gone the color of old parchment, but he rallied one final time. "These are all lies and fabrications. The evidence speaks for itself. The arsenic bottle was found in the defendant's possession." "The bottle you planted there," James said, rising from his seat with deadly calm. He pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "This is a receipt from Brennan's Pharmacy in Cheyenne, dated 3 days before Judge Thornfield's collapse. A receipt for arsenic, purchased by one Silas Peterson for pest control purposes." The silence that followed was broken only by Peterson's ragged breathing. The pharmacy receipt passed from hand to hand through the jury box, each man examining it with growing horror. The handwriting was Peterson's, his signature unmistakable. "I also have testimony," James continued relentlessly, "from two gamblers who heard Mr. Peterson boasting about his plan to get rid of the half-breed and claim the Thornfield fortune. Seems our fine attorney has been more talkative than wise when liquored up." Peterson looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal, seeing nothing but hostile faces and closed doors. His carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread, and everyone could see the spider at its center. "It's all circumstantial," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't convict a white man on the word of savages and foreigners." But his words fell on ears that had already heard too much truth to stomach any more lies. In the jury box, 12 faces reflected the dawning understanding that they had been manipulated, used as pawns in Peterson's deadly game. The foreman, a grizzled rancher named Bill Crawford, stood up slowly. "Your Honor," Crawford said, his voice heavy with disgust, "the jury don't need to deliberate. We've heard enough to know which way the wind's blowing." Judge Hamilton looked around the chaotic courtroom, then at Sarah sitting quietly in her chair, tears streaming down her face but her spine straight as an arrow. "The court will recess while I consider these new developments," he announced, but his words were lost in the chaos. Peterson made his move then, pulling a small derringer from his coat pocket with the desperate speed of a man with nothing left to lose. "Nobody's leaving this courtroom until I get what's mine," he screamed, the little pistol wavering between Sarah and Judge Thornfield's prone form. The crowd pressed backward like a tide, women screaming and men shouting. But Sarah didn't flinch even as Peterson advanced toward her with the gun extended. "You cost me everything," Peterson snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "My reputation, my money, my future." "All for what? So some half-breed squaw can live to spread more of her heathen poison?" "Silas?" The voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the chaos like a knife through cloth. Judge Thornfield had somehow found the strength to sit up on his stretcher, his dying eyes fixed on the man who had tried to murder him. "You're better than this." "Better?" Peterson's laugh was the sound of breaking glass. "I was never better than anything. Born poor, stayed poor, while men like you inherited everything. Well, now it's my turn to take what I want." James was moving then, flowing across the courtroom with the fluid grace of a cavalry officer. But Peterson saw him coming and swung the derringer in his direction. "Stay back, or the girl dies first." Time seemed to slow to honey thickness. Sarah could see James frozen mid-step, could see Peterson's finger tightening on the trigger, could see her father struggling to rise from what might be his deathbed. In that crystalline moment, she understood that her life hung by a thread no thicker than spider silk. But she also understood something else. She had spent her life being afraid of not being Indian enough, not being white enough, not being woman enough, or strong enough, or worthy enough. She had been afraid of her Cherokee blood, afraid of her white father, afraid of loving James because it might dishonor Thomas's memory. She was tired of being afraid. Sarah stood up slowly, her shackled hands folded in front of her like a prayer. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice steady as bedrock, "if you're going to kill me, at least let me die knowing why my mother loved the man who abandoned her." Peterson blinked, confused by her calm in the face of death. "What are you talking about?" "Judge Thornfield," Sarah said, never taking her eyes off Peterson's face. "Tell me about Little Singing Bird. Tell me why she never spoke bitterly of you, not once in all the years I knew her." From his stretcher, Thornfield's voice came like autumn wind through dying leaves. She had a laugh like water running over stones, and she saw good in everyone, even men who didn't deserve it. His voice broke. "Even me." The derringer wavered in Peterson's grip. Around the courtroom, people held their breath as death and redemption balanced on the edge of a madman's decision. And in that moment of perfect tension, Sarah Running Bear Thompson looked into the eyes of her would-be killer and saw not evil, but a broken man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. "She would have forgiven you too," Sarah said softly. "That's what love does. It forgives even when forgiveness seems impossible." Peterson's hand began to shake, the derringer dipping toward the floor as 25 years of poison finally began to drain from his heart. Peterson's hand trembled like a leaf in a storm, the derringer wavering between Sarah and the floor as her words echoed through the silent courtroom. For a moment that stretched like eternity, everyone held their breath, waiting to see if forgiveness could triumph over 25 years of poison and desperation. Then Peterson's face crumpled like old parchment, and he collapsed to his knees, the gun clattering across the wooden floor. "I never meant for it to go this far," he sobbed, his voice breaking like a child's. "I just needed the money. I just needed to survive." James moved swiftly to secure the weapon while Sheriff Mason stepped forward with iron shackles that had been meant for Sarah's wrists. But she stopped them both with a gentle shake of her head. "Let him speak," she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Let him tell the truth before we chain him with it." Peterson looked up at her through tears that had carved clean tracks down his dusty cheeks. "I bought the arsenic weeks ago, but not to kill him outright. I thought if I made him sick enough, confused enough, he'd change his will in my favor. Just small doses mixed with his laudanum. Nothing fatal, just persuasive." Judge Thornfield struggled to sit up on his stretcher, his breathing labored but his eyes sharp with understanding. "But when Sarah's healing started working, when I began to recover, you panicked. You were getting stronger." Peterson's voice cracked with desperation. "All my work, all my careful planning, and that woman was undoing it with her Cherokee magic. I had to do something before my creditors came calling." Martha Kowalski pushed through the crowd, her weathered face a map of disgust and pity. "So you planted evidence on an innocent girl and let a whole town believe she was a murderess. And all for money that wasn't yours to take." "I never wanted anyone to hang," Peterson protested, but his words rang hollow in the stunned courtroom. "I thought the trial would be enough to discredit her. I thought someone would step forward with reasonable doubt." "You counted on our prejudice," said Bill Crawford, the jury foreman, his voice heavy with shame. "You knew we'd rather believe the worst about a half-breed than question a white man's word." The truth of it settled over the courtroom like dust after an explosion. Sarah looked around at the faces of people who had been ready to watch her hang, and instead of hatred, she felt only a deep, aching sadness for how quickly fear could turn neighbors into strangers. James stepped closer to her, his presence a warm anchor in the storm of revelation. "It's over," he said quietly. "The truth is out. You're free." But Sarah's attention was fixed on her father, who had grown even paler during Peterson's confession. She could see death approaching him like shadows at sunset, and suddenly all the years of imagined hatred seemed like wasted time. "Judge Hamilton," she called out, her voice carrying across the chaos, "I request permission to approach the bench." The territorial judge looked around his disrupted courtroom, then at Sarah's composed face, and nodded slowly. "Permission granted, though I suspect this day has moved far beyond normal legal procedure." Sarah walked forward, her shackles finally removed by a shame-faced deputy. She knelt beside her father's stretcher, taking his cold hand in both of hers. The courtroom fell silent again, straining to hear their whispered conversation. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why abandon her? Why abandon me?" Thornfield's eyes filled with tears that had been 25 years in the making. "Because I was young and stupid and terrified of losing everything I thought mattered. My family's approval, my inheritance, my place in society. His grip tightened on her hand with what little strength remained to him. I didn't understand that I was throwing away the only things that actually mattered. She never spoke badly of you, Sarah said, her own tears falling freely now. Even when I asked why I didn't have a father like other children, she just said that some loves are too big for this world to hold. A sound escaped Thornfield's throat that might have been laughter or sobbing. She always was wiser than me. Wiser and braver and more beautiful than I deserved. He looked up at his daughter's face, seeing little singing bird's features reflected in her own. Can you forgive a foolish old man who spent a lifetime learning what he should have known from the start? Sarah thought of her mother's teachings about the Cherokee Way, that forgiveness was not weakness, but the strongest medicine of all, healing wounds that festered in darkness and grew poisonous with time. She thought of Thomas, who had loved her despite the world's disapproval, and of James, who had risked everything to stand beside her when she had no one else. "I forgive you," she said simply, and felt a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying lift from her shoulders like morning mist. Thornfield smiled then, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. Stronger than both of us. Wiser than I ever was." He struggled to reach into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded document with trembling fingers. "This is my will, written in my own hand and witnessed properly. It leaves everything to you, not because you're my daughter, though you are, but because you're the only person in this town who tried to heal instead of harm." Sarah took the document, but her eyes never left his face. "What about Mrs. Thornfield? What about your other obligations? Elizabeth is provided for separately, and she knows it. As for my other obligations—" He glanced toward Peterson, who sat slumped in defeat between two deputies. "I think I've finally learned the difference between what I owe society and what I owe my soul." Mrs. Thornfield approached then, her face streaked with tears but her expression resolute. "Sarah," she said, her voice steady despite her grief, "I want you to know that I harbor no resentment. Cornelius told me about your mother years ago in his fever dreams and guilty confessions. I always knew there was someone else, someone who held the best part of his heart." She reached out to touch Sarah's shoulder. "I'm glad he finally found the courage to make things right." The gesture broke something loose in Sarah's chest, a knot of pain she had carried since childhood. She rose and embraced the woman who might have been her stepmother under different circumstances, and felt another piece of healing click into place. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat, trying to restore some semblance of legal order to the proceedings. "In light of the evidence presented and confessions given, this court hereby dismisses all charges against Sarah Running Bear Thompson. Furthermore, Silas Peterson, you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit perjury." The courtroom erupted in cheers and shouts, but Sarah heard it all as if from a great distance. She was watching her father's face, seeing the peace that settled over his features as the weight of his secrets finally lifted. His breathing was growing more labored, each breath a visible struggle. "James?" she called softly, and he was beside her instantly, as if he had been waiting for her summons his entire life. "I'm here," he said, taking her free hand while she held her father's with the other. "This is James McCarthy," she said to Thornfield, "Thomas's brother, the man who saved my life." Thornfield's eyes focused on James with effort. "You're a good man to stand by her when everyone else turned away. Thomas chose well when he chose you as a brother." James felt the weight of generations in those words, the passing of responsibility from one protector to another. "She didn't need saving," he said quietly. "She needed someone to stand witness to her strength." Thornfield smiled again, and Sarah saw something of her mother in that expression. the same quiet joy that little Singing Bird had carried even in sorrow. "Take care of each other," he whispered, his voice growing fainter. "Love is the only thing that survives when everything else turns to dust." Those were his last words. Judge Cornelius Thornfield died holding his daughter's hand, surrounded by the truth he had spent a lifetime hiding and the forgiveness he had never dared to seek. The man who had abandoned love out of fear passed into whatever comes after having finally learned its true value. In the silence that followed, Sarah felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer the half-breed healer who belonged nowhere, no longer the accused murderess awaiting judgment. She was Sarah Running Bear Thornfield Thompson, daughter of two worlds, keeper of her mother's wisdom and her father's redemption. And she was not alone. 1 year later, the autumn leaves danced golden and crimson around the small schoolhouse that had risen where Judge Thornfield's stables once stood. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly where new life grew, watching as children of all colors bent over their lessons. Cherokee children sat beside German immigrant youngsters. Mexican ranch hands' daughters worked arithmetic problems next to the sons of Irish railroad workers. "Mrs. McCarthy," called out little Tommy Peterson, not the attorney's son, but his nephew, left orphaned when Silas died in territorial prison 3 months after his conviction. "I finished my Cherokee alphabet. Want to see?" Sarah smiled at the boy who had found his way to her schoolhouse door last spring, thin and hungry and carrying shame that wasn't his to bear. She had taken him in without question, and James had taught him to ride and rope with the patience of a man who understood what it meant to carry family guilt. "Show me, Tommy," she said, walking over to examine his careful work. The Cherokee syllabary flowed across his slate in neat rows, each symbol representing the sounds of her mother's language that she had almost let die with her. Martha Kowalski emerged from the kitchen section of the schoolhouse, flour dusting her apron and the smell of fresh bread following in her wake. At 69, she had found new purpose as the school's grandmother figure, teaching cooking and practical skills while Sarah handled letters and numbers, and James instructed the older boys in useful trades. "Dinner's ready, children," Martha announced, her Polish accent still thick after 40 years in America. "Wash your hands, all of you." "And Tommy Peterson, that means scrubbing behind your ears, too." The children laughed and scrambled for the wash basins, their chatter filling the schoolhouse with the sound Sarah had learned to love above all others, the sound of hope taking root in young voices. These children would grow up seeing each other as neighbors and friends rather than strangers to be feared. They would carry forward the lesson she had learned in that terrible courtroom, that truth and love were stronger than prejudice and fear. James entered through the back door, his work clothes dusty from a day spent building new shelves for their growing library. The inheritance from Judge Thornfield had been substantial, enough to establish the school, purchase books and supplies, and ensure that no child would be turned away for lack of funds. But more than the money, Sarah treasured the knowledge that her father had finally chosen love over fear, even if it came at the end of his life. "How are you feeling today?" James asked, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead as he washed his hands at the basin. The question had become part of their daily ritual as her pregnancy progressed, his concern evident in every glance and gesture. "Strong," she replied, the same answer she had given every day for the past 4 months. "Strong and grateful and ready to bring this child into a world where he or she can be both Cherokee and white without having to choose." They had married again 6 months after the trial, this time in a ceremony that honored both their traditions. The Cherokee elder who had performed the blessing spoke of 2 rivers joining to become something greater than either could be alone, while the Methodist minister talked about love conquering all obstacles. The whole town had attended, some out of genuine support and others out of curiosity, but all had witnessed the union of two people who had found each other in the midst of darkness. Mrs. Thornfield, Elizabeth, had become an unexpected ally and friend. Her own grief had been complicated by relief, as if her husband's death had finally freed her from a marriage built on his guilt and her resignation. She had moved to Denver to live with her sister, but she visited the school regularly, bringing books and supplies and stories of her travels. "Sarah," she had said during her last visit, "I want you to know that Cornelius was happier in his final months than I'd seen him in 20 years. Knowing you, claiming you as his daughter, it gave him peace he'd never had before." The schoolhouse bell rang as the sun began to set, calling the children to evening prayers before they returned to their homes scattered across the valley. Sarah watched them file out in small groups, some walking, others climbing onto horses or into wagons driven by parents who had learned to trust the half-breed teacher with their most precious possessions. As the last child disappeared down the dusty road, James and Sarah stood together on the schoolhouse steps, his arm around her shoulders and her hand resting on their unborn child. The valley spread before them in the golden light of sunset, peaceful and prosperous and slowly healing from the wounds that fear and prejudice had carved into its soul. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Sarah asked, a question that came to her sometimes in the quiet moments. "Teaching them to see past differences, to judge people by their character rather than their blood?" James considered the question seriously, as he did all her doubts and concerns. "I think," he said finally, "that we're teaching them what your mother knew and your father learned too late, that love is stronger than fear, truth is stronger than lies, and people are more than the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth." A rider approached from the north, and Sarah recognized the familiar figure of Sheriff Mason. He had aged visibly since the trial, the weight of his role in nearly executing an innocent woman etched deep in the lines around his eyes. He had become one of the school's most ardent supporters, perhaps seeking redemption through service to the children he had once been prepared to orphan. "Evening, folks," he called out as he dismounted. "Got a letter for you from the territorial capital. Looks official." Sarah's heart skipped as she opened the envelope, remembering too well how official letters had once meant nothing but trouble. But this letter brought different news entirely. "It's from the Territorial Education Board," she said, her voice rising with excitement. "They're officially recognizing our school and offering to provide additional funding for expansion." James whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet despite her growing belly, spinning her around until she laughed and protested that he was making her dizzy. Sheriff Mason grinned, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen on his face since the trial. "That's wonderful news," he said, "though I can't say I'm surprised. Word's been spreading about what you're doing here. Got inquiries from 3 other counties about starting similar schools." The idea of their small experiment spreading filled Sarah with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunset. Perhaps her father's redemption could reach beyond his own soul, beyond even their small valley. Perhaps love really could triumph over fear, one school and one child at a time. As Sheriff Mason rode away with promises to spread the good news, Sarah and James walked hand in hand toward their own small cabin beside the school. It was a modest place, built with their own hands and furnished with simple necessities, but it felt like a palace to Sarah after the years of uncertainty and displacement that had defined her earlier life. Inside, they sat together by the fireplace, James reading aloud from a book of Cherokee legends that Sarah was translating into English for the school library. Her mother's stories lived again in these pages, wisdom passed down through generations, finding new voice in a new time. "This one's about the woman who married the thunder," James read, his voice gentle in the lamplight. "She was caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, until she learned that her strength came not from choosing sides, but from bridging the gap between them." Sarah smiled, recognizing her mother's gentle way of teaching through story. Little Singing Bird had known that her daughter would face this very choice, had prepared her for it through tales that seemed like entertainment but carried the weight of prophecy. "I think," Sarah said, settling more comfortably against James's shoulder, "that our child will grow up knowing exactly where he or she belongs." "Where's that?" James asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Right here," Sarah replied, her hand covering his as it rested on her belly. "In a world where love matters more than blood, where truth matters more than tradition, where the future matters more than the past." Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Sarah offered up a silent prayer of gratitude to her mother's spirit and her father's memory. She had found her place at last, not as Cherokee or white, not as victim or survivor, but as a woman who had learned to transform pain into purpose, fear into love, and division into unity. The baby stirred beneath her hand as if responding to her thoughts, and Sarah knew that the future would bring its own challenges and heartaches, but she also knew that love, real love, could overcome anything, even the deepest wounds of prejudice and fear. In Redemption Falls, as autumn gave way to winter and new life prepared to enter a changed world, the truth had indeed set them free. Dear friends, Sarah's story reminds us that it's never too late for redemption, forgiveness, and finding where we truly belong. At 55, 60, or 68, we've all carried wounds from choices we made or didn't make, relationships that ended badly, or dreams we abandoned out of fear. Like Judge Thornfield, we might wonder if we've wasted too many years, hurt too many people, or missed too many chances to make things right. But Sarah's journey shows us that love can heal decades of pain, that truth has power even when it comes late, and that building bridges matters more than building walls. Her father found peace in his final moments not because he lived a perfect life, but because he chose courage over comfort when it mattered most. The schoolhouse Sarah built represents what we all long for, a legacy of love that outlasts our mistakes, a place where future generations can learn from our hard-won wisdom rather than repeat our errors. Every day we wake up is another chance to choose healing over hurt, connection over isolation, hope over regret. The question isn't whether we deserve a second chance, it's what we'll do with the one we have right now. What moment in your life do you wish you could revisit with the wisdom you have today? Have you found your own way to turn past pain into purpose for others?